I'm really excited to introduce Holly Ranger, who is an independent writer and researcher interested in the intersection of critical classical reception with the history of scholarship. Their research has appeared in the Classical Receptions Journal and the International Journal of the Classical Tradition, and their work on Sylvia Plath has been published in the volume Sylvia Plath in Context, Cambridge 2019, and the Bloomsbury Handbook to Sylvia Plath, Bloomsbury 2022. Their monograph, Sylvia Plath and the Classics, is forthcoming in the Bloomsbury Academic Series, Classical Receptions in 20th Century Writing. I'm very excited for that personally. They currently work at the University of Sheffield in the UK, where they lead the open research team in the library, and they believe that their research and professional practices are concerned with the same questions, namely, are our disciplinary methods robust? How can we become more transparent, and what does that look like? So please join me in welcoming Holly with their paper, The Wounded Attachments of Feminist Classical Receptions.
Thanks so much for the intro, and hello everyone. I will share my screen. So just a quick content note for everybody. So there won't be any explicit details, but there will definitely be mentions of sexual violence, miscarriage, the logic of cisness as transphobic and racist, and also a couple of mentions of suicide as well towards the end of the paper. And just a quick note to say that I'll also be using the word feminist without always prefacing it or qualifying it as white feminist, partly because most of the scholarship that I'm critiquing doesn't qualify its feminism as white, but that's what I'm dealing with at the moment. So scholarly attention to women's classical receptions has blossomed over the last 2 decades, with the prevailing scholarly paradigm positioning such texts as feminist reclamations of the female agentic voice. And yet an observation made by Van der Zyko and Miriam Leonard in 2006 remains as true today as it was 20 years ago, namely that in all these theorizations of women's turn to myth, there's a tendency to overlook the strangeness of women's choice to revivify ancient narratives to arm contemporary struggles, and its engagement with the products of an androcentric society, which can also be seen to justify its most basic patriarchal assumptions. Moreover, as Emily Greenwood notes, the addition of a Black feminist perspective to Zyko and Leonard's observation further complicates the strangeness of this move to Greek mythology and raises important questions about the cultural identity of feminist thought. So following Greenwood's line of thinking, I'm going to offer one explanation in this paper for mainstream white feminism's turn to myth, by arguing that classical myth's repository of stories of sexualized violence is both appealing to and amenable to a feminism attached to woundedness, an epistemology of white ignorance that is a key component of white feminism's move to innocence. That is, these stories insist on the interpolative power of sexualized violence to define the category woman, a category that is already white and cis. The implication of this insistence, to quote Emma Heaney, is to claim that cisness is all I have. It's all white women have to differentiate their claims from simple white supremacy or simple class supremacy. It's the only way that they can name themselves as resistant political subjects fighting power rather than just benefiting from it, wielding it. Read in this light, the focus on sexual violence in so many feminist classical receptions is not so much a reclamation of the female voice as it is a reification of the purported naturalness of the category woman, one that is defined by its woundability, innocence, whiteness, and cisness. Feminist classical receptions can thus play into, and are certainly easily co-opted by, contemporary cultural scripts about the innate definitional woundability of cis white women, a script that I'm sure I don't need to remind anybody here today is currently being wielded by fascist regimes in the US and beyond to dismantle protections for and recognition of our trans siblings and colleagues under the banner of defending women. I'm not necessarily arguing that feminist classical receptions do this consciously, but I do want classicists to contend seriously with the possibility that one explanation for the current best-selling popularity of feminist classical receptions is that the way that they bolster a hegemonic insistence on binary sexual difference, which is always already racialized. Now, before I proceed any further, I'd like to be clear that in questioning feminist narratives of sexualized violence, I'm not validating the pejorative right-wing framing of feminist theory, queer theory, and critical race theory as merely complaints or grievances. And I'm not dismissing the empowering, consciousness-raising effect of testimonial accounts of sexual violence, in which imaginative works of fiction play a role. The scholarly paradigm of myth as a tool to give voice to women's experiences is, of course, grounded in the idea of feminist testimony, the idea that one can reclaim subjectivity and power by speaking out after power has been taken through sexual violation. So what I'm drawing on here is the work of Wendy Brown and those who have built on her work, such as Alison Phipps. And I've particularly found useful Brown's analysis of the ways in which narratives of personal pain, here we might say using myth to give voice to women's experiences, can be depoliticized and co-opted. And these stagnate in what Brown calls wounded identities, which both legitimate and depend upon state power by calling for punishment and retribution. Brown argues that women's narratives of personal pain are particularly at risk of neoliberal commodification because of the enduring discursive co-constitution of femininity and vulnerability, as well as the centrality of experience to feminist epistemologies and politics. But such politics of experience have always tended towards essentialism, being concerned with describing and bounding difference rather than attending to the structures which produce difference. To relate this point to the matter at hand, it's that the scholarly paradigm of myth as a tool to give voice to women's experiences is underpinned by a feminism which is seeking, in effect, to define what a woman is. What are women's experiences? Is this how we know what a woman is? And who gets to speak about these experiences? And what we end up with frequently in feminist classical receptions is a speaking subject who's in constant sexualized danger. It's a purported critique of patriarchy that, to quote Emma Heaney again, reifies the categories woman and man that do patriarchy's brutalizing work. And so I'm reading Brown's formulation of woundedness in tandem with recent trans feminist scholarship by Heaney, as well as Jules Gill-Peterson, both of whom have delineated how cis women stake a territorial claim to rape victimization that sidelines the experience of minoritized subjects who are disproportionately subject to sexualized violence. And moreover, this woundability is invoked to justify acts of violence against marginalized others. Now, I'm not actually going to analyse any contemporary works of feminist classical reception today, partly because Amy Hines Scott already brilliantly dismantled the white feminism in many works of feminist classical receptions. Also because Valeria Spacciante has recently contextualized the popularity of feminist classical receptions in relation to the book market and the commercialization of this facile white feminism that many of these texts employ. But it's also because I found it helpful in trying to pinpoint where feminist classical reception scholarship has gone wrong, to return to the 1960s and to Sylvia Plath, whose work features prominently in what is invoked as the founding essay of feminist classical reception scholarship, Adrienne Rich's When We Dead Awaken, Writing as Revision. It's the essay that underpins virtually all contemporary theorizations of women's work with myth. As I will turn to at the end of the presentation, it's an essay that I think has been fundamentally misread by feminist classical reception scholars. But what I want to draw out first is how Plath's engagement with the classics evinces a critique of the classics that I'm going to argue is much closer to Rich's original formulation of revision. So the poems that Plath composed in 1962 and 1963 are marked by a sustained focus on gendered archetypes and an engagement with cultural representation of women, from 1940s pinup girls back to the classical heroines. Now, Plath's classical reception practice predates this period, but these late poems display an intensified focus on classical heroines and classicized representations of women. And Plath does this by adopting a series of persona. So she takes on the speaking persona of Clytemnestra or Medea. But we have to understand and contextualize Plath's engagement with ancient texts as part of a broader poetic interrogation at this time of inherited cultural gender scripts, so wife, mother, daughter. Plath's classical heroines are also part of Plath's broader shift in interest at this time towards more explicitly personal autobiographical work, which was an innovative project to use poetry to articulate a feminine subjective experience. Now, the keen-eared might have noticed that I've just invoked the scholarly paradigm that I said I'd critique, namely the idea that classical precedents can aid women in giving voice to their experiences. And I do think Plath is trying to do that. She's experimenting with drawing on different poetic traditions for her project. But as I'm going to argue today, in doing this, what she actually does is expose the limit beyond which classical texts fail to articulate a feminine subjective experience. Now, Plath's longest sustained experiment in articulating or attempting to articulate an embodied feminine subjectivity is the long verse play Three Women, a poem for three voices from 1962. Set in a hospital maternity ward, the poem's 53 stanzas comprise the three interwoven monologues of three unnamed women. First voice, who births a son, second voice, who miscarries, and third voice, who gives birth to a daughter she places for adoption. The poem's representations of miscarriage and so-called illegitimate pregnancies was taboo breaking at the time and offered a provocative challenge to normative early 1960s societal discourses of motherhood, fertility, and sexuality when it was broadcast as a BBC radio play. But despite the diversity of Plath's representations of women's desires around and attitudes towards pregnancy and motherhood, however, they form one side of Plath's construction throughout the play of a gendered, essentialized dichotomy between feminine experience and masculine reason, one which explicitly plays with Platonic and Ovidian constructions of the female body as respectively sites of philosophical ignorance and sites of sexual violence. To provide some quick context, Plath had previously engaged with Plato in an earlier poem, Magi, and specifically with the unequal equivalence that Diotima sketches out in the Symposium between gestation and poetry as forms of making which are set in a gendered hierarchy. So this is Magi. The abstracts hover like dull angels, nothing so vulgar as a nose or an eye bossing the ethereal blanks of their face ovals. Their whiteness bears no relation to laundry, snow, chalk, or such like. They're the real thing, all right, the good, the true, salutary and pure as boiled water, loveless as the multiplication table, while the child smiles into thin air. 6 months in the world, and she is able to rock on all fours like a padded hammock. For her, the heavy notion of evil attending her cot is less than a bellyache, and love, the mother of milk, no theory. They mistake their star, these papery godfolk. They want the crib of some lamp-headed Plato. Let them astound his heart with their merit. What girl ever flourished in such company? So in this poem, a mother observes a set of ethereal figures who attend her daughter's cot. But rather than the three witches who attend births in fairy tales, these attending spirits are the pure forms of Platonic philosophy, the real thing, all right, the good, the true. Yet these spirits are powerless over the baby daughter, to whom grand theory is meaningless in the face of bellyache and love for milk. Throughout this earlier poem, Plath sets in tension the embodied knowledge of the mother-daughter dyad with the personified abstracts of Platonic epistemology and metaphysics, who have surpassed the vulgarity of embodiment. In the world of mother and daughter, however, this metaphysical quality renders the forms dull and sterile as boiled water. Rather than affirming their status as the supreme object of Platonic contemplation, the forms are sterile white blanks, and I'll come back to that. Plath's transformation of the forms into a nursery mobile towards the end of the poem, papery godfolk who hover above the child's crib, further mocks the forms, who are now the literal object of the blurred vision of a newborn, more than a divine object of rational contemplation. Besides, what girl ever flourished in such company? Now, while that seems to be separating women from the masculine world, it is also a punchline. It's partly about Diotima, but it's also because Plath read Plato along with the Greek classics at Cambridge, and she is engaged in this poem in the act of making both poems and babies. But if she ironizes this gendered Platonic dichotomy in Magi, she seems to employ it much less ambiguously in the later poem, Three Women. Plath signals early in this long poem that she's revisiting Magi and her earlier engagement with Plato. In the opening monologue of Second Voice in stanzas 3 to 6, in which Second Voice describes miscarrying her pregnancy, Plath reuses the opening line of the earlier poem, The Abstracts Hover Like Dull Angels, to make explicit the continuity between the two poems' associative webs. When I first saw it, the small red seep, I did not believe it. I watched the men walk about me in the office. They were so flat. There was something about them like cardboard, and now I had caught it, that flatness from which ideas, destructions, bulldozers, guillotines, white chambers of shrieks proceed, endlessly proceed, and the cold angels, the abstractions. So Plath draws on the structuring dichotomy she established in Magi between an embodied femininity and masculine abstractions. But here it's Second Voice's implication in the masculine world that seems to have induced her miscarriage. She can't play with it like the speaker of Magi can. In her elaboration of this masculine world in Three Women, Plath takes a further associative step and links masculine rationality with the bureaucratized and industrialized violence of Nazism, and in the following stanzas, environmental contamination and the alienation of Fordism. The stanza that I've quoted here on screen also exemplifies the imagery of flatness and whiteness that Plath associates with the masculine world throughout Three Women, characteristics which also accrete to Second Voice after her miscarriage. She says, I am bled white as wax. Plath uses white 19 times in Three Women, and while it refers predominantly to the visual property of whiteness, hospital bedsheets and lab coats, its uniform association with the masculine world, coupled with its appearance in the earlier poem as associated explicitly with the Platonic forms, suggests that whiteness is emerging in Plath's poem as an abstract concept, associated with masculinity, reason, Nazism, and the classical. But it's also a quality that Plath explicitly disassociates from the feminine by linking the women of the poem with the colour red, which appears 12 times. So we see this move to innocence enacted here by Plath doubling down on the gender dichotomy, which she distinguishes with two different colours, white and red. And if the masculine world of Three Women is Platonic, then the feminine world is Ovidian. So stanzas 7 to 9 of the poem introduce the listener to Third Voice, in whose first monologue Plath concentrates the majority of Three Women's Ovidian allusions. Plath seems at first to be drawing a contrast between the modernist, mechanized world inhabited by Second Voice and the pastoral world of classical myth inhabited by Third Voice, using Plato as a cipher for the world of men and masculine reason, and Ovid as a cipher for the world of women and natural processes. But it soon emerges that these two discursive worlds are linked by a shared and pervasive male violence. So this is how Third Voice describes her experience of conception. And all I could see was dangers, doves and words, stars and showers of gold, conceptions, conceptions. I remember a white, cold wing and the great swan with its terrible look coming at me like a castle from the top of the river. There is a snake in swans. He glided by. His eye had a black meaning. I saw the world in it, small, mean and black, every little word hooked to every little word, and act to act. A hot blue day budded into something. I wasn't ready. The white clouds rearing aside were dragging me in 4 directions. I wasn't ready. Although we could say that Plath adopts a sequence of personae from Ovid's Metamorphoses here, she does not directly identify any of Ovid's women by name, only the vehicle of their rape by Zeus, a shower of gold for Danae, a swan for Leda, and a cloud for Io, and there might also be Callisto's transformation into a constellation there as well. This elusive technique erases the individual women's subjectivities and narratives, and it serves to emphasize the archetypal and repetitive and essential nature of male acts of violence. The interpolative effect of sexual violence as that which creates woman is underscored by Plath's choice of 2 tales depicted together on Arachne's tapestry at Metamorphoses 6, Danae and Leda. This then shadows the monologue with 16 further victims of sexual violence and brings into focus the unifying theme of Ovid's representations of women. Now, I think Plath is using Ovid here unironically to illustrate her argument that the female body is defined as a site of sexual violence. And in her poetry more broadly, Plath does certainly subscribe to essentialist conceptions of gender, where the masculine is inherently violent. But in drawing upon Ovid to express this experience, what Plath's Arachne-like distillation of Ovid's tales of rape exposes instead is the limit of the patriarchal imaginary, beyond which classical texts cease to be of any use for articulating a feminine subjectivity that is not circumscribed by violence. It's a subjectivity bounded by patriarchy and which does patriarchy's work of categorization. So I want to skip forward now to one of the last poems that Plath composed in February 1963. And I want to draw a contrast between Plath's use of classical allusion in Three Women, whereby women are constructed as victims, disassociated from the perpetration of violence, but also disassociated from whiteness, and Plath's use of classical allusion here, which seems to be using classicism knowingly as a mechanism that genders and racializes subjects. The woman is perfected. Her dead body wears the smile of accomplishment. The illusion of a Greek necessity flows in the scrolls of her toga. Her bare feet seem to be saying, "We have come so far, it is over." Each dead child coiled, a white serpent, one at each little pitcher of milk now empty. She has folded them back into her body as petals of a rose close when the garden stiffens and odours bleed from the sweet, deep throats of the night flower. The moon has nothing to be sad about, staring from her hood of bone. She is used to this sort of thing. Her blacks crackle and drag. Now, despite Plath's insistence on the illusion of this scene, no other poem in Plath's body of work, perhaps in any poet's body of work, has been as biographically determined as Edge, a poem that is widely and literally interpreted as Plath's suicide note. But if Plath is casting herself as a classical suicide in this poem, then the surfeit of classical allusions in Edge confounds any attempt to locate a singular source text for the poem. The scene of infanticide seems to confirm the presence of Medea, although the Medea of Euripides and Seneca is famously no ordinary tragic wife, refusing to die by suicide, unlike, it seems, the woman of Edge. Perhaps the poem represents the death of another Greek heroine then, but it defies the conventions of tragic female suicide with which Plath was familiar. Offstage, a noose, a bedchamber. Indeed, the poem's spectacularized tableau more readily recalls the matricide Orestes' triumphant display of Clytemnestra's body at the close of Aeschylus's Coephoroi. And what are we to make of the poem's marmoreal and serpentine imagery, which invokes Giorgio de Chirico's Ariadne statues and Shakespeare's Cleopatra? If Plath is invoking a mythic archetype here, then I think we should be suspicious of one so parodically overdetermined. The woman of Edge is at once Medea and Clytemnestra and Ariadne and Cleopatra. If we entertain the possibility that Plath is in fact invoking a discourse of classicism in Edge, rather than any particular classical narrative, then we begin to see classicism's ideological accretions, that which is dredged up by a turn to the classical. Because Plath's overdetermination of the tragic female archetype is accompanied in the poem by an overdetermination of whiteness. Seemingly triggered by the loaded signifier Greek in line 4. In this short poem, the reader encounters snow, frost, bone, milk, the moon, a toga, white serpents, and the marble group of the woman and her infants. And then, after 19 lines of whiteness, the final line of the poem introduces the colour black, which crackles through the image of the classicized white woman like television static, a kind of signal noise that suggests that the ideological accretions of classicism cannot simply be discarded in the act of voicing a classical figure as a woman. We know that the woman of Edge has adopted her classical persona consciously. She wears the smile of accomplishment. But what the poem also suggests is that these accretions of whiteness dredged up by her turn to classicism as an aesthetic and representational mode have proven fatal for the poem's gendered subject as well. This poem is, after all, in the third person, not the first. If Plath had come to the realization that classical precedents are a representational dead end, then perhaps Edge kills off the tragic archetype that circumscribed what she could express. So, to conclude, as Plath's Three Women shows, classicized representations of women, and particularly those text constructions of women as, or woman as a category defined by sexual violence, are particularly amenable to a feminism that wishes to dissociate itself from an implication in violence and whiteness by insisting on its woundedness and woundability. Moreover, if the feminist project is, as claimed, to give voice to women's experiences, Plath's Edge shows us that classicism is a representational trap anyway, one that circumscribes what it's possible for the gendered subject to express. To return briefly to Adrienne Rich's original formulation of revision in her 1972 essay, Rich calls on women to re-enter the patriarchal myths that have circumscribed women's lives from a new critical direction, not to pass on a tradition, but to break its hold over us. And what has got lost in much of the feminist classical reception scholarship that builds on Rich's revisionary framework, however, is that revision is explicitly posited as a reflexive act of awakening consciousness. In the essay, Rich riffs on Virginia Woolf's original rejoinder in a room of one's own to the women scholars at the University of Cambridge, not to forget about the women who are not here tonight, for they are washing up the dishes and putting the children to bed. Rich reminds her own scholarly audience not to fall prey to the myth of the special woman who masters patriarchy's texts, but loses sight of the women who are washing other people's dishes and caring for other people's children. Rich argues that revision is not just rewriting patriarchy's texts from a woman's perspective, but it's a critical engagement that incorporates both a reflective analysis of women's engagements with hegemonic texts and an analysis of power relations between women, between white women and racialized others, notwithstanding any woman's personally minoritized position vis-a-vis patriarchy. Now, I'm not arguing for a return to or a recuperation of Adrienne Rich here. She was, after all, heavily involved in another foundational text, that of transphobic feminism, the transsexual empire. But a feminist turn to the classical must be critical and reflexive, cognizant of one's own complicity in hegemonic discourses of classicism and binary gender. Because for feminists to invoke the classics unthinkingly is always at the expense of non-normatively gendered and racialized others. And as Plath's poem Edge suggests, to invoke the classics unthinkingly is also fatal for the self. I want to reiterate again that I'm not dismissing the consciousness-raising effects of feminist testimony, but as classicists, we must be suspicious of feminist retellings of ancient myths that are so assimilable to commercial interests and hegemonic cultural discourses of gender. The proper object of feminism is not the category woman or a universal definition of what a woman's experience is and how it might be expressed. Feminism's proper object of critique is the power that creates the category woman. It's a power that draws on the classical, and it's a category that is always already white and cis. Thank you.